Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our journey takes us into some truly challenging historical material. A perspective you likely won't find in typical history books or even, frankly, conventional academic summaries. We're about to embark on a, let's say, candid exploration of the church's journey, stretching from its earliest days right up to the present, focusing on aspects that, have often been overlooked or perhaps even purposefully obscured. This is where we pull back the curtain and really unpack some significant historical claims.
What's particularly compelling about the material we're examining today is its assertion that, while many people possess only a really superficial understanding of what genuinely transpired throughout history.
Yeah, that's surface level view.
Exactly. And this is especially pertinent when we consider the tumultuous events leading up to foundational moments like the Reformation. Our goal today is really to help you gain a crucial historical perspective, even if some of the details are, unsettling or might challenge deeply held preconceived notions. Without this more comprehensive understanding, the source we're looking at contends, it becomes remarkably difficult to truly grasp the complexities of our present world or the prophetic implications some scholars find in Scripture.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to guide you through this incredibly rich, sometimes shocking and undeniably complex material, all drawn directly from our provided sources. We'll be highlighting key events, influential figures, and the profound implications suggested by these texts.
Yeah.
And we want to be very clear with you. We are here to understand what the source says, to impartially convey the ideas it presents, not to endorse its specific viewpoints or, engage in any form of proselytization.
That's crucial. It's about understanding the narrative presented.
Exactly. This is about shedding light on a historical narrative that, frankly, demands our attention and critical thought. So how does our source set the stage for this deep dive? And why is this particular historical foundation so important, according to it?
Well, the source opens with a pretty foundational argument that you simply cannot fully grasp the present, or indeed what it refers to as prophetic implications, without a firm grip on this historical context.
Right.
It posits that even those who identify, say, with the Protestant Reformation often have only a surface level appreciation of its true origins and the vast historical currents that led to it. Essentially, it's an invitation to look unflinchingly at a past that many find uncomfortable precisely because its echoes resonate so strongly in today's world. It's saying, you need this background.
That's a powerful point, and it immediately sets a distinctive tone, doesn't it? Let's jump right into the first phase of our deep dive then. The early church and the shadow of Rome, covering the period from roughly 30 AD to 300 AD.
Right.
Our source begins by drawing a distinction between the mystical real church, the spiritual body of believers that Jesus himself first announced in Matthew 16, and the historical institutional church. It contrasts that ideal with the very earthly church described back in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. These letters, often referred to as report cards from Jesus to 7 specific churches, apparently delivered some rather, surprising news to their recipients.
Yes, the source suggests they were surprised at the report card, implying they were already in big trouble as early as 96 AD.
As early as 96 AD.
Indeed. The source highlights that by the time Revelation was published, around that time, the church, in its institutional form, was already exhibiting significant issues. It proposes that if one truly wishes to understand what a church ought to be, a careful study of the book of Acts and those initial 7 letters from Revelation should serve as the primary guides.
So it's challenging the idea of a purely golden age right at the start.
Pretty much. This perspective challenges the common assumption that all early church history represents some kind of pristine ideal, suggesting instead that deviations began quite early on.
That's certainly a strong assertion from the source, laying out a challenging framework for what we're about to explore. This early period, as the source points out, was characterized by intense external pressures too, right?
Absolutely.
From the general perspective of the Roman world, the nascent Christian movement was often viewed through a lens of bigotry and bloodshed.
Yes, suspicion and misunderstanding.
And quite understandably, from a Jewish perspective, it was met with merciless persecution. When we delve into the historical records, it can be quite shocking, really, to realize the extent of crimes committed throughout history, sometimes tragically, in the name of the church itself.
And this prompts us to consider, why is this often dismal, even violent history so crucial for us to examine today?
Right, why dredge this up?
The source argues emphatically that without a valid, unfiltered perspective on these historical events, we cannot truly grasp the present complexities of society, and especially not the prophetic implications that it suggests are woven into the fabric of Scripture.
So it's foundational knowledge, according to this view.
It's presented as an essential prerequisite for understanding the broader unfolding narrative of human history and its spiritual dimensions. You can't understand the end of the story without the beginning, essentially.
Okay, so if we set aside the spiritual ideal for just a moment and focus on the practical, historical, and political environment, we witness the monumental rise of the Roman Empire.
A huge factor.
Our source meticulously traces Rome's expansion from its legendary founding in, 753 BC, through its conquests of Italy, Carthage, Greece, Asia Minor, Spain, Gaul, Britain, and eventually Judea in 63 BC.
A vast sweep of history.
This created what the source describes as an almost worldwide administrative environment. This vast political infrastructure, combined with the earlier Greek conquest that had established a universal language across the Mediterranean,
Greek, yeah.
it inadvertently set the stage for the gospel, providing pathways and shared communication for its spread. It's a fascinating observation, isn't it? How seemingly secular geopolitical developments often play a role in larger historical and spiritual movements.
It really is. And the source mentions key emperors, too. Julius Caesar, around 46-44 BC, marking the start. Augustus, during Jesus' birth. Tiberius at the crucifixion, Caligula, who tried to desecrate the temple but failed, Claudius. It grounds the story in that Roman context. But a critical detail that emerges from the source material is the shift in the nature of persecution during this era.
Okay. How so?
In the very early days, as recorded in the book of Acts, most persecutions were primarily driven by local Jewish communities, often fueled by, internal religious disagreements or maybe envy.
Right, like we see with Stephen or Paul initially.
Exactly. However, it wasn't until Emperor Nero in the mid-1st century that Roman emperors themselves systematically targeted Christians.
Nero, the Fire of Rome guy.
The very same. He infamously blamed the devastating burning of Rome on Christians, initiating severe imperial persecution that led to the execution of prominent figures like the Apostle Paul. This marked a significant escalation. It became state policy, not just local trouble.
So the nature of the threat shifted dramatically, moving from localized disputes to an empire-wide policy of suppression. That's a huge change.
Precisely. These imperial persecutions continued under various emperors, some periods more brutal than others. However, the source points to Diocletian, whose reign extended to 305 AD as arguably the most severe of all.
Diocletian.
Worse than Nero.
According to this source, yes, in terms of systematic intent. His objective was a systematic elimination of Christians, often achieved by torturing them to death. It was brutal.
Wow.
This era of intense, merciless persecution saw Christians seeking refuge in the labyrinthine Roman catacombs, those underground burial networks.
Right, the catacombs.
And this relentless pressure brings us to a figure whose actions dramatically reshaped the church's trajectory and, as the source argues, laid the groundwork for much of what followed. A figure often widely misunderstood.
And that would be Constantine.
That'd be Constantine. You're referring to Constantine, of course. This period, roughly the early 300s AD, inaugurates Section 2. Constantine and the Christianization of the empire. Constantine's story is indeed pivotal. Our source recounts the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, where he allegedly experienced a vision, or at least that became the popular narrative, right?
Yeah.
In this sign conquer story.
That's the traditional account. Whether vision or shrewd political move, the result was the same.
Following his decisive victory, he issued the Edict of Toleration, which established freedom of religion across the empire. This was a monumental shift, allowing Christianity to emerge from the shadows and become a visible, though not yet sole, part of the cultural landscape.
A huge turning point. But a key insight from the source is Constantine's primary motivation, fostering unity in the empire.
So less about personal conversion, more about practical politics.
The source definitely leans that way. From his perspective, it explains, various religious practices of his time, Mithras worship, sun worship, and Christianity could, in his strategic vision, be rationalized and thus unifiable under a broad imperial umbrella.
Interesting, like merging spiritual streams for imperial stability.
Pretty much. His reforms were truly substantial, though. He is credited with establishing Sunday worship, forbidding work on Sundays, a significant change, especially beneficial for slaves, reducing the practice of slavery, eliminating gladiatorial fights, and even making it illegal to kill unwelcome children.
So some genuinely positive social changes came out of it, regardless of the core motivation.
Yes, objectively, those were major shifts, but the Force emphasizes they were ultimately driven by that desire for imperial cohesion.
He was a fascinating and complex figure, and his legacy is, to say the least, controversial. Our source points out that Constantine adopted some very revealing titles. As the traditional head of the pagan priesthood, he held the title Pontifex Maximus, but he also took on the additional title of Vicarius Christi.
Right, Vicar of Christ.
And the source unpacks that for us, explaining it means another Christ, or more precisely, in place of Christ.
Yeah, that's a heavy title.
The source clarifies that the Latin vicarius carries the same meaning as the Greek anti in Antichrist, both signifying in the place of. This linguistic connection to Antichrist as one in place of Christ is a powerful link, the source emphasizes.
That's a connection many might miss.
He was also the first ecumenical leader presiding over the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, with the clear ambition, as you said, of unifying all the various religious factions within his vast empire.
This prompts an important question for reflection raised by the source. Could Constantine, with his profound ambition for religious and political unification, be viewed by some as a kind of prototype?
A prototype for what?
A prototype of a coming world leader who might attempt a similar kind of global consolidation, blending religious and political power. The source certainly posits this idea, inviting us to consider historical patterns.
That's a provocative thought. And to further solidify his break with pagan Rome and its entrenched aristocracy, Constantine undertook the monumental task of moving the capital.
Right, a huge shift.
From Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople in 330 AD, establishing it as the New Rome. This move was largely driven, the source says, by his frustration with the local Roman elite, who stubbornly clung to their traditional pagan religions.
He wanted a fresh start, a Christian capital free from that old baggage.
So he didn't just unify religions, he literally shifted the geographical center of imperial power. Yet, despite Constantine's pivotal role, it wasn't actually him who made Christianity the state religion, was it?
No, that's a common misconception the source corrects. It was actually his third successor, Theodosius.
Theodosius, right. He governed from 378 to 395 AD.
And he formally declared Christianity the official state religion of the entire world. Not just tolerated, but official.
And this had profound and immediate consequences, according to our source. It led to widespread forced conversions, didn't it?
Yes, effectively filling the churches with what the source describes bluntly as unregenerate members, people joining for political or social reasons, not necessarily faith.
And this influx, in turn, fueled the emergence of pomp and so forth within a visibly more worldly church, blurring the lines between spiritual devotion and imperial politics.
Exactly. The character of the visible church began to change dramatically. This development naturally led eventually to the empire's division into East and West.
Right.
The western part of the empire ultimately succumbed to barbarian invasions in 476 AD, a period often recognized as the onset of the Dark Ages in Europe.
The fall of Rome.
While the eastern segment, however, known as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for another 1,000 years, until its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD.
A much longer run.
But it is out of the complex intrigues and power struggles of the Roman bishops during this transitional period that we observe a tremendous impact on our lives today, as the source argues, culminating in the rise of what we now recognize as the papacy.
And that transition brings us directly to section 3, the ascent of the bishops of Rome, covering roughly 300 AD to 1050 AD.
A critical period.
The very title, Pope, derived from Papa or Father, was initially a common term applied to all Western bishops, wasn't it?
That's right. It wasn't exclusive initially.
However, according to our source, from about 500 AD onward, this designation gradually began to be restricted specifically to the Bishop of Rome, signifying a growing claim to unique authority. Now, what the source uncovers next is striking. Really, it states unequivocally that for 500 years, the bishops of Rome were not popes in the modern sense.
Not in the way we think of the papacy today.
Furthermore, the established Catholic tradition that Peter was the first pope is presented by the source as fiction without any historical or biblical basis whatsoever.
That's a direct challenge to a foundational Catholic belief.
It is. The source even cites 1 Peter 5.3, where Peter himself cautions against being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. It presents this as a stark contrast to the later, increasingly hierarchical claims of papal authority.
A key insight from the source is how early Roman bishops certainly attempted to assert their influence and authority over other bishops, but for a considerable period, these efforts had, well, no significant effect.
So they were making claims, but nobody was really buying it universally.
Pretty much. These were largely self-assertions that simply didn't gain widespread acceptance across the Christian world at that time. It's noteworthy that by the end of the 4th century, 5 primary centers of church authority had emerged: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria.
The Pentarchy, right.
Exactly. The bishops of these centers were known as patriarchs, and crucially, they held equal authority, each having jurisdiction over their own respective provinces, with no hint of overlapping claims to universal supremacy yet.
Okay, but after the empire's division in 395 AD, things started to shift. Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria began to acknowledge the leadership of Constantinople.
Right, the new imperial capital in the east.
Which intensely magnified the pre-existing power struggle between Constantinople and Rome. Bishop Siricius, the Bishop of Rome from 395 to 398, attempted to claim universal jurisdiction over the whole church.
Another early attempt.
But, as the source notes, with the empire itself fracturing, his assertion ultimately gained little traction. The timing wasn't right, perhaps.
And zooming out for a moment, the source highlights how this ancient struggle between the Eastern and Western centers of Christianity is directly linked, it argues, to the roots of the problem in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia that persist even to this day.
Wow, connecting it that directly to the Balkan conflicts?
Yes. It describes 3 distinct ethnic traditions, 3 religions, and 3 different sources of enduring conflict in that region: Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Muslims. The source makes it clear that there's no high ground in this complex history, with all sides having accumulated a legacy of atrocities over the last 1,500 years.
That really helps understand how deeply these historical, religious, and political divisions can run, with consequences spanning millennia. It's incredible.
It really puts modern conflicts into a much longer perspective.
It does. Okay, moving forward within this ascent, some historians consider Leo I, who served as Bishop of Rome from 440 to 461 AD, to be the first pope in a more recognizable sense.
Leo the Great.
At this time, the Western Empire was under weak emperors and beginning to fragment under the pressure of barbarian invasions. Leo I successfully obtained imperial recognition from Emperor Valentinian III for his claim as primate over all bishops.
A significant political win for Rome.
And what the source reveals next is quite significant. He successfully persuaded Attila the Hun to spare the city of Rome in 452 AD.
A legendary encounter.
And then, in 455 AD, he induced Gaiseric the Vandal to show mercy on the city. Having achieved this diplomatic feat twice, his reputation was profoundly cemented.
He became a hero figure for Rome.
Following these successes, he declared himself Lord of the whole church, and even advocated for the death penalty for heresy. That's a significant escalation in claims and proposed actions.
It is, and it's particularly insightful how the source frames the ironic consequence of Rome's fall to the barbarians.
How so?
The fragmentation of political power after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire created a significant vacuum. This allowed a more assertive leader like the Bishop of Rome to become the most commanding figure in the West, precisely because the established political structure was a shambles.
So the political chaos actually helped the Bishop of Rome gain power.
In a way, yes. Freed from direct civil authority, he could forge advantageous alliances with the new barbarian kingdoms and consolidate a new form of power, a spiritual political hybrid.
That power vacuum was certainly a game changer. Our attention then turns to Gregory I, who served from 590 to 604 AD and is often regarded as the first real pope.
Gregory the Great. Many see him as the start of the medieval papacy.
He emerged during a period of widespread political anarchy throughout Europe. His conspicuous leadership, often involving negotiations with various kings and tribal leaders, helped to stabilize the times.
He stepped into the breach.
He was known for tirelessly working towards the purification of the church, taking steps to depose neglectful or unworthy bishops, and actively opposing simony, that pervasive practice of buying and selling church offices, which was a significant problem.
Right, cleaning house to some extent. The source describes him as a good man, one of the purest and best of the popes.
High praise, especially given the context.
And this brings us to another pivotal figure in the papacy's ascent, Charlemagne, whom the source describes as a remarkable leader.
Charlemagne, king of the Franks, later emperor.
The source details a crucial alliance formed between Pope Zacharias and Pepin, Charlemagne's father. This alliance was instrumental in Pepin being crowned King of the Franks.
A quid pro quo, essentially. Papal blessing for political legitimacy.
Pretty much. Later, Pepin's successor, Stephen II, sought Pepin's military aid to conquer the Lombards, who were threatening Rome. Pepin succeeded and, in turn, granted a large portion of central Italy to the Pope.
The donation of Pepin.
Exactly. This monumental act marked the beginning of the Papal States, a literal piece of ground ruled by the Pope as a temporal sovereign, which endured for 1,100 years until 1870.
11 centuries of the Pope as a king.
Placing this in broader context, this was a major event in world history as it firmly established the papacy in a position of world power, not just spiritual, but political and territorial. It fundamentally changed the game.
So the popes became not just spiritual leaders, but legitimate temporal rulers over their own physical territory. Now, around the time of Nicholas I, who was the first pope to actually wear a crown.
The symbolism is important.
A deeply significant and controversial document appeared. The Isidorian Decretals.
Ah, yes, the false decretals.
Our source explains that these documents purported to be letters and decrees from bishops and councils dating back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. However, centuries later, they were conclusively discovered to be deliberate forgeries.
Complete fabrications?
Their explicit purpose was to exalt papal power, effectively stamping the papacy with the authority of antiquity and retroactively dating the pope's temporal power by 5 centuries.
A bold move to rewrite history.
The source doesn't mince words, calling this the most colossal literary fraud in history.
It's particularly insightful how these forgeries contributed to what the source terms the Great Cleavage, the widening breach between the Eastern and Western churches.
How did they contribute to the split?
Well, prior to 869 AD, all ecumenical councils were held in or near Constantinople, and they were primarily conducted in Greek, not Latin. Nicholas I's attempts to interfere in the internal affairs of the Eastern Church, bolstered perhaps by these forged claims of ancient authority, led to mutual excommunication.
So the claims became too much for the East to accept.
Exactly. The increasingly audacious claims of the Roman Church became unbearable to the East, leading to their eventual separation in 1054 officially, though the drift was long before that.
And that chasm deepened over centuries.
Significantly. Notably through the brutal treatment of Constantinople by Pope Innocent III's armies during the Fourth Crusade.
Which was supposed to go to the Holy Land, right?
Yes, but got diverted to sack the Christian city of Constantinople instead. A major scandal. And later, the formal dogma of papal infallibility in 1870 further solidified the split.
How does the source characterize the two branches after the split?
It views the Eastern Church as an early form of Christianity mixed with Greek and Oriental paganism, while the Western Church, in its analysis, mixed primitive Christianity with Greek and Roman paganism. Different blends of syncretism, essentially.
Okay. Having navigated the complex political and religious landscape of the early church and the papacy's rise, our journey now plunges into what our source unflinchingly calls the darkest period of the papacy, a 200-year stretch from roughly 870 to 1050 AD.
Yeah, often referred to as the midnight of the Dark Ages for the papacy itself.
Imagine an era where the highest spiritual office was utterly consumed by, well, bribery, corruption, immorality, and bloodshed. The examples from our source are truly shocking, and they force us to confront the profound depths to which an institution can fall.
It's pretty grim reading, and this prompts a critical inquiry. How did such a level of depravity become so entrenched within the supposed highest spiritual office of the church?
Right, how does that happen?
The source provides vivid and disturbing instances. For example, Sergius III, who was pope from 904 to 911, had a mistress named Marozia. She, along with her mother Theodora and her sisters, virtually controlled the papal chair for decades, systematically installing paramours and illegitimate sons into the papacy.
Controlled the papacy, how?
Through political influence, wealth, strategic marriages, and likely intimidation in the chaotic environment of Rome at the time. This period, from 904 to 963, is actually referred to by some historians as the rule of the harlots, underscoring the profound moral collapse.
That's an astonishing claim, almost unbelievable given the office.
It is stark. Our source continues with more disturbing examples. John X was reportedly brought from Ravenna and made pope by Theodora for her more convenient gratification. He was later smothered to death by Marozia.
Smothered to death, a pope.
Allegedly. She then successively elevated several other figures to the papacy, including her own illegitimate son, who became Pope John XI.
Her son became Pope.
And then her grandson, John XII, became Pope. He was described as guilty of almost every crime, including violating virgins and widows, living with his father's mistress, and notoriously turning the papal palace into a brothel.
A brothel. The Lateran Palace.
According to the source, yes. He was ultimately killed while in an act of adultery by the woman's enraged husband.
Just.
Wow.
And the source mentions others buying the office.
Yes, Benedict VI and John the Knight-Necks, both of whom simply bought the papacy through open bribery, demonstrating how leadership became a commodity, completely detached from any spiritual qualification.
So it wasn't even about family influence sometimes, just cold, hard cash.
Precisely. Further examples of extreme corruption cited by the source include Benedict IX, who became pope as a boy, a mere 12 years old, through a money bargain with powerful Roman families.
12 years old.
12. He was recorded as committing murders and adulteries in broad daylight and even robbing pilgrims at the graves of martyrs. The source unequivocally labels him the worst of the popes.
That's quite a title.
There were periods with 3 rival popes simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy. It got so bad that Clement II was eventually appointed by Emperor Henry III of Germany because, as the source quotes a contemporary bishop, no Roman clergyman could be found who was free of the pollution of simony or fornication.
Not a single one. That's an indictment of the entire Roman clergy at the time.
It paints a stark picture of how deeply corruption and the practice of buying and selling church offices simony had permeated and fundamentally compromised the institution.
This era of profound depravity, where the spiritual office was treated as a personal commodity, offers a powerful lesson from our source, doesn't it?
It does. That even the most sacred institutions are vulnerable to the corrupting influence of unchecked temporal power, especially when wealth and ambition eclipse moral integrity. It's a recurring theme we see throughout this history.
After this incredibly dark period, the papacy remarkably entered what some would call its golden age of power, largely under the formidable influence of a figure named Hildebrand.
Hildebrand, yes, a key reformer.
He led the papacy into this new era, roughly from 1049 to 1294, eventually becoming Pope Gregory VII from 1073 to 1085. He initiated major reform efforts, especially against simony.
Tackling that head on.
Since most bishops and priests at the time had purchased their offices directly from kings for money, his efforts to eliminate this deeply entrenched revenue source brought him into direct and often violent conflict with King Henry IV, the Emperor of Germany.
The investiture controversy, yeah, a major showdown.
These conflicts led to devastating wars throughout Italy, though Gregory ultimately succeeded in making the papacy largely independent of temporal power from secular monarchs, at least in theory.
A hard-won independence, and this newly gained independence from temporal power set the stage for one of the most historically powerful popes, Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216.
Innocent III sounds peaceful, but the source paints a different picture.
Very different. The source presents Innocent III as one of the most powerful of all popes, who boldly claimed to be vicar of Christ and so vicar of God, supreme sovereign over the church and the world.
Supreme sovereign over the world.
That was the claim. The source makes a chilling statement. It alleges that Innocent III murdered more Christians than all the Roman Caesars put together.
That's a staggering claim, more than all the Caesars.
That's what the source asserts. Kings of Germany, France, England, and practically all the monarchs of Europe, including even the Byzantine emperor, obeyed his will. The source asserts that never in history has any one man exerted more power across such a vast dominion.
It's hard to comprehend that level of influence, and our source provides the details to underscore his immense power and impact, right?
It does. Innocent III ordered 2 crusades.
Including the disastrous Fourth Crusade we mentioned.
Yes, and the Albigensian Crusade against fellow Christians in France. He decreed transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine of communion literally transform into the actual body and blood of Christ.
A core Catholic doctrine formalized then.
He confirmed confession as a sacrament, declared papal infallibility, meaning the Pope cannot err in matters of faith or morals when speaking ex cathedra.
Infallibility, that early, though formally defined later, right?
He asserted the principle, yes, though the dogma was formalized in 1870. He also condemned the Magna Carta.
The foundation of English liberty, condemned it.
Absolutely. He forbid the reading of the Bible in the vernacular languages, wanting to keep interpretation controlled by the clergy. And crucially, he instituted the Inquisition.
instituted the Inquisition. It's hard to overstate the scope of his influence and the lasting, often devastating impact of his decrees on both religious and secular life.
And that leads us directly to the profound horrors of the Inquisition. It was formerly called the Holy Office, instituted by Pope Innocent III, and perfected under Pope Gregory IX.
Perfected. A chilling word choice. How did it work?
The system was insidious by design. Everyone was required to inform against heretics. Anyone suspected was subject to torture without even knowing the name of their accuser.
Secret accusers.
Yes. The proceedings were secret, and once the inquisitor pronounced sentence, the victim was turned over to civil authorities for imprisonment, or often to be burned alive at the stake.
Burned alive.
A truly grim detail that emerges from the source is that the victim's property was confiscated and then divided between the civil and religious authorities, serving as a direct financial incentive for conviction.
A financial incentive for persecution? That adds another layer to the depravity described. So it wasn't just about doctrine, it was also about profit and power.
The source certainly implies that was a major factor. The Inquisition's most deadly work, according to our source, was directed against groups like the Albigenses, also known as the Cathari, in southern France and northern Italy.
Who were they? What did they believe?
These groups preached against priesthood immorality, rejected the clergy and their claims to authority, opposed the Church of Rome, made great use of the scriptures, and lived what were described as self-denying lives with zeal for moral purity. By 1167, they apparently constituted a majority of the population in southern France.
A majority. So they were a real threat to Rome's authority there.
Absolutely. In 1208, Pope Innocent III ordered a crusade against them that utterly wiped out town after town. The inhabitants were murdered without discrimination until all the Albigenses were systematically exterminated.
Genocide, essentially.
The source uses language consistent with that. Similarly, the Waldenses, another group who emphasized Bible reading and evangelism, were largely wiped out over time through relentless persecution.
Just for reading the Bible and disagreeing with Rome.
That's the picture the source paints. It records that in just 30 years, between 1540 and 1570, no fewer than 900,000 Protestants were allegedly put to death by the Pope's war against them in various regions.
900,000 in 30 years. The scale is almost unimaginable.
This prompts a truly important question. How could such an institution justify these actions, and what does it reveal about its self-perception?
Right.
The source states unequivocally that for 500 years, the Inquisition was the most diabolical thing in human history. And what's truly chilling is the source's claim that none of the infallible popes ever apologized for its record.
No apology.
Not according to this source. Instead, many of the instigators and leaders of the Inquisition were actually elevated to sainthood.
So the perpetrators were honored, not condemned, by the institution.
That's the stark picture it paints. An institution that, according to the source, embraced extreme violence and systematic extermination as a means to power and control, and never formally repented of these actions. It suggests a profound institutional memorial and a justification for past deeds.
And the claims of authority continued unabated, didn't they? Boniface VIII, who reigned from 1294 to 1303.
Yes, he issued his famous bull, Unam Sanctum,
declaring that it is altogether necessary for salvation that every creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. That's about as explicit a claim to absolute authority as you can get.
It really is. Yet Dante, the renowned poet who visited Rome during Boniface's reign, called the Vatican a sewer of corruption and famously assigned him, along with other popes, to the lowest parts of hell in his literary work, the Divine Comedy.
So even contemporaries saw the hypocrisy.
Clearly. The history of Europe, as our source presents it, is repeatedly a history of bloodshed resulting from struggle for power. That is, temporal earthly power between the popes and various kings.
Pope versus emperor, pope versus king.
Constantly. Roman Catholicism, it asserts, has become the most persecuting faith the world has ever seen. The source even cites Canon Llorente's detailed record of over 3 million victims in Spain alone from the Inquisition, underscoring the immense human cost of these power struggles.
3 million in Spain alone.
This really reinforces the source's theme of a constant struggle for earthly power, with immense human cost and spiritual distortion. The source makes a poignant point that these historical horrors remain as memorials to dogmas that, astonishingly, it claims, still remain in force today.
Still in force. How?
While we may not hear much about them in general discourse, and they're not actively operative where the Catholic Church isn't dominant, the source suggests that these legal and theological mechanisms, the justifications for persecution, are technically still in place within canon law.
So they haven't been formally repudiated.
Not according to this analysis. It implies that in certain parts of the world, for instance, where the Catholic Church holds greater sway, the potential for such procedures to be enforced could, theoretically, re-emerge, making this history not merely ancient, but a living precedent in their view.
That's a sobering thought. The potential for historical mechanisms to re-emerge under different circumstances. Now let's move into section 5. The Renaissance popes and the dawn of the Reformation, covering approximately 1305 AD to 1517 AD.
Right, leading up to Luther.
This period kicks off with a major blow to papal prestige and authority. After the death of Pope Benedict XI, the papal palace was controversially removed from Rome to Avignon, France,
The Avignon papacy, or the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, as some called it.
where it remained from 1305 to 1377. For 70 years, the papacy became, in the words of our source, a mere tool of the French court, losing much of its independent spiritual and political standing.
A huge blow to its universal claims, and it's noteworthy that this relocation then led to an even more chaotic period where, for the next 40 years, there were 2 sets of popes.
2 popes at once. The Great Schism.
Exactly. One resided in Rome and the other back in Avignon. Each claimed to be the legitimate vicar of Christ, and as the source vividly puts it, was hurling anathema at each other, cursing each other publicly.
That must have caused immense confusion and scandal across Europe.
It did. It severely undermined the moral authority and spiritual claims of the papacy in the eyes of many. Such blatant schism naturally led to questioning and discontent, fertile ground for reform movements.
And the corruption during this period and into the Renaissance era itself was truly extreme, according to our source, John Ticky III.
Antipope John Ticky III technically during the schism.
Right. He served from 1410 to 1415 and is described by the source as the most depraved criminal who ever sat on the papal throne, allegedly guilty of nearly every crime, including sodomy, violating virgins and nuns, and openly denying the future life.
Just staggering accusations.
Pius II, another Renaissance pope, was said to be the father of many illegitimate children and openly spoke of methods used to seduce women. Paul II reportedly filled his house with concubines. These, our source emphasizes, are not isolated incidents, but represent a pattern of profound moral decay at the highest echelons of the church.
Indeed, the source details a litany of unbridled ambition and vice among the Renaissance popes. Sixtus IV, for example, sanctioned the notorious Spanish Inquisition.
So he enabled Torquemada.
Yes. He also decreed that money could deliver souls from purgatory, a lucrative practice, and blatantly used the papacy to enrich himself and his relatives, appointing 8 of his nephews as cardinals, some of whom were mere boys. Pure nepotism.
8 nephews as cardinals.
Innocent VIII had 16 children by various married women, decreed the extermination of the Waldenses, and appointed the brutal Thomas of Torquemada as Inquisitor General of Spain. This consistent pattern of corruption, nepotism, and moral compromise reveals a deep institutional sickness, according to the source.
And the list continues, painting a truly grim picture.
Placing this in a larger historical frame, Alexander VI, often cited as the most corrupt of the Renaissance popes,
The Borgia Pope.
the very one. He notoriously bought the papacy, had numerous illegitimate children whom he openly acknowledged and appointed to high church office, like his son Cesare Borgia. He and his family allegedly murdered cardinals and others who stood in their way.
Just ruthless power politics.
Absolutely. Then Julius II, known as the warrior pope, also bought the papacy, led vast armies into battle himself, and issued indulgences for money to fund his military campaigns and artistic projects, like St. Peter's Basilica.
So the money from indulgences funded wars and art.
Exactly. This period truly exemplifies the intersection of extreme secular power, immense wealth, and profound moral corruption within the papacy, pushing it far, far from any spiritual ideal presented in its founding texts.
It paints a picture of stark contrast to any spiritual ideal whatsoever. Into this world, this cauldron of corruption and power, in 1483, a baby boy named Martin was born.
Martin Luther.
Born to a very poor coal miner in Eisleben, Saxony. He initially set out to become a lawyer. But in 1504, during a severe lightning storm where lightning struck a tree right next to him, he cried out to St. Anne, vowing to become a monk if he were saved.
A life-changing moment.
True to his word, he withdrew from law school and entered an Augustinian monastery. He dedicated himself to a rigorous, almost torturous piety. fasting for 10 to 15 days, sleeping without blankets in freezing temperatures, and beating his body black and blue in hopes of purging sinful thoughts.
Trying to earn salvation through extreme works.
He went to confession so often that his abbot famously told him, according to the source, "Martin, either go out and commit a sin worth confessing or stop bothering me." He was a man deeply troubled by his own perceived sinfulness and searching desperately for peace and assurance.
This prompts a vital question. How did this deeply troubled man, Martin Luther, finally find the elusive peace and certainty he longed for, given the intense spiritual anguish he endured?
Right, what was the turning point?
During a pilgrimage to Rome in 1509, seeing the corruption firsthand, by the way, a wise monk suggested he read the Book of Habakkuk from the Old Testament.
Habakkuk. An unlikely source, maybe?
Perhaps, while he was painfully climbing Pilate's staircase on his knees in Rome, a ritual meant to earn indulgences, the verse Habakkuk 2.4, "The just shall live by faith," suddenly illuminated his mind.
Justification by faith. Solidified.
Exactly. This revolutionary idea prompted him to cease his ritual, stand up, and return to Wittenberg to rigorously explore this concept. It's noteworthy, the source suggests, that Habakkuk 2.4 serves as the glue for Paul's trilogy of epistles. Galatians, Romans, Hebrews, all dealing with profound aspects of living by faith and not by works or rituals. This was Luther's aha moment.
That single verse changed everything for him. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church.
A legendary act protesting the sale of indulgences by people like Tetzel.
This act ignited what we now know as the Reformation, which our source calls probably the single most important event in history.
High praise indeed.
Naturally, the existing church leadership did not take kindly to his challenging views. He was subsequently excommunicated at the Diet of Worms in 1521.
Where he refused to recant.
An event that followed his public burning of the papal bull demanding his retraction. His famous words, "Here I stand, I can do no else, so help me God," cemented his resolve and launched a movement that reshaped not just the church, but the entire continent of Europe and beyond.
Indeed, the Reformation, as the source describes it, was an attempt to return to what it saw as original Christianity, free of pagan influences, with open Bibles, religious freedom, and the crucial separation of church and state.
Ideals that sound familiar today.
But this quest for reform sparked centuries of brutal conflict, ushering in Section 6, the Counter-Reformation, wars, and modern policies. It wasn't a peaceful transition.
These were known as the Counter-Reformation Wars. Our source explicitly states these were all started by Catholic kings, urged on by the Pope and Jesuit for the purpose of crushing Protestantism.
A direct accusation of cause.
The scale of human suffering was immense. The source makes the stark assertion that the thousands of the martyrs of the Caesars of Rome were dwarfed by the millions of the Vatican, indicating a far greater death toll in these religious conflicts compared to early Roman persecution.
A chilling comparison. And a critical detail that emerges here are the specific examples of these devastating conflicts. The wars waged against German Protestants from 1566 to 1609, the systematic wars against Protestants in the Netherlands during the same period.
The Dutch Revolt, yeah.
The brutal Huguenot wars in France from 1572 to 1598, King Philip II's ambitious but failed attempt against England with the Spanish Armada in 1588.
Trying to overthrow Elizabeth I.
And the truly devastating 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, which decimated much of Central Europe, starting as a religious conflict.
Unbelievable bloodshed.
The source notes that Pope Leo X, the same one dealing with Luther, who had become a cardinal at just 13 and held 27 church offices, declared the burning of heretics a divine appointment. This demonstrates a shocking institutional endorsement of persecution and extreme violence as theological policy.
A divine appointment to burn people. And Rome's answer to Luther and the Reformation wasn't just military might, but also the formation of a specific religious order, right?
Yes, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus.
Founded by Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuits were dedicated to absolute and unconditional obedience to the Pope and, chillingly, the destruction of heresy, meaning anything that differed from the Pope's dictates.
Their methods, the source tells us, were diverse and often ruthless, including deception, immorality, vice, even murder. They were seen as the Pope's elite troops in the Counter-Reformation.
To place this in a larger historical frame, the Jesuits were directly implicated, according to the source, in atrocities like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on August 24, 1572.
A horrific event. Catherine de' Medici, the formidable mother of the French king and an ardent Romanist, urged on by the Pope, gave the order for the massacre.
What happened?
It led to the slaughter of thousands of Huguenots, French Protestants, who had gathered in Paris for a royal wedding, seen as a moment of reconciliation. It was a trap.
Thousands killed in one event.
Yes. The source highlights great rejoicing in Rome, with the Pope and his cardinals singing a special mass and thanksgiving and even striking a commemorative medal.
Celebrating a massacre.
That's what the source claims. The extent of extermination in the following decades was horrific. In Bohemia, the population shifted from 80% Protestant in 1600 to only 800,000 Catholics remaining out of an original 4 million, after the Habsburgs and Jesuits had systematically purged dissent. Similarly, in Austria-Hungary, half the Protestant population was slaughtered over time.
Just systematic eradication. Moving into the more modern era, our source continues to expose what it describes as a consistent pattern of papal claims and policies. Pope Leo XIII, who reigned from 1878 to 1903.
Relatively recent history.
He claimed he was appointed to be head of all rulers, and that he held on this earth the place of Almighty God. He emphatically re-emphasized papal infallibility, denounced Americanism, the separation of church and state idea, and proclaimed that the only method of cooperation for Protestants was complete submission to the Roman pontiff.
Still asserting that supreme authority.
The source states unequivocally that the suppression of freedom of conscience, the oppression, imprisonment, and torturous death of non-Catholics has characterized their primary agenda for centuries. A very strong claim about the institution's historical agenda.
This prompts a critical inquiry. How consistent are these historical patterns even in more recent memory? The source details the Vatican's unholy alliances, as it calls them, with totalitarian governments during the 20th century.
Like who?
It points out that Hitler himself reportedly viewed his anti-Jewish policies as manifestly consistent with the churches over the previous centuries, only more efficient.
Hitler saw his actions as consistent with church history.
That's the chilling point the source raises. The 1929 Concordat with Mussolini in Italy and the 1933 Concordat with Hitler in Germany are presented as historical records demonstrating Vatican's sanction and agreement with these regimes, lending them legitimacy.
Agreements with fascist dictators.
What the source further claims, which has sparked much historical debate, is that beyond the silence of the Church during the Holocaust, the Vatican also allegedly organized and funded rat lines to help Nazis, including major war criminals, escape after the war.
Rat lines.
Yeah.
Helping Nazis escape. That's a very serious charge.
It is. The source presents this as a matter for further research and investigation, highlighting a controversial aspect of the institution's modern history, one often debated by historians.
And the suppression extended to knowledge itself, didn't it? Our source reveals a striking and consistent institutional pattern across centuries.
Regarding the Bible, yes.
Where popes, including figures like Innocent III, Gregory IX, Clement XI, Leo XII, Pius VIII, Pius IX, and Leo XIII, actively worked to suppress personal access to Scripture, going so far as to condemn Bible reading and Bible societies themselves. A consistent discouragement of individual interpretation.
This persistent discouragement of individual engagement with the Bible is a critical thread throughout this history, aimed, the source argues, at maintaining centralized control over interpretation.
Similarly, regarding religious freedom, the source names Clement VIII, Innocent X, Leo XII, Pius VIII, Pius IX, and Leo III as popes who consistently condemned, rejected, annulled, and protested religious freedom, only advocating for tolerance in countries where they were a minority.
So, condemn it where you have power, ask for it where you don't.
That's the pattern the source highlights, suggesting a strategic rather than principled stance on the issue historically.
Another key historical point highlighted by our source involves indulgences, which are linked to the pagan idea the source claims of purgatory, an idea the source states is non-biblical. Right, the sale of forgiveness, essentially.
Indulgences became a key source of revenue for the Vatican, essentially selling spiritual merit. Sixtus IV, in 1476, was the first pope to apply them to souls already believed to be in purgatory.
Extending the market, so to speak.
And perhaps most infamously, John Tetzel, in 1517, sold certificates signed by the pope, offering pardon of all sins to buyers and their friends without confession, repentance, or even absolution by a priest, encapsulating the commercialization of salvation that so enraged Martin Luther. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs was his jingle, reportedly.
To place this in a larger historical frame, the source argues that the Vatican has opposed consistently every democratic advance from absolute monarchies, toward government by the people.
Oppose democracy.
A prime example cited is Innocent III's immediate denunciation of the Magna Carta in England in 1215, which he encouraged King John to fight against the barons, leading to great destruction in the country. This illustrates, for the source, a consistent historical pattern of resistance to popular governance and individual rights, favoring instead hierarchical and centralized power structures.
Okay, now let's pivot to Section 7. Contemporary events and prophetic implications, spanning from the 1990s to the present. This brings us much closer to home.
Right into our lifetime.
On March 29, 1994, an astonishing joint declaration titled Evangelicals and Catholics Together. The Christian Mission in the Third Millennium was signed by a long list of major evangelical leaders and Catholic leadership.
ECT, yeah, that caused a huge stir in evangelical circles.
A pivotal point our source highlights is its suggestion that this implied a compromise of the gospel and raised a profound, almost uncomfortable question. Did millions of Christians willingly get burned at the stake over a misunderstanding?
A very pointed question.
Especially considering that persecution of Protestants is, according to the source, still technically official Catholic policy in some interpretations of canon law, yet evangelicals signed what amounted to a truce.
A key insight from the source regarding the Catholic Church's involvement in this declaration is its Evangelization 2000 program.
What was that?
The source describes this as an initiative aimed at stepping up its evangelization of Protestants into the Catholic Church. So while the ECT declaration presented a message of unity and shared mission, the underlying agenda, according to source, was a strategic re-engagement with an aim to draw Protestants into the Catholic fold.
So not quite equal partnership in their view.
More a form of spiritual absorption rather than genuine ecumenical partnership based on equal theological footing, as the source sees it.
This leads to an even more remarkable statement from the Pope on May 22nd, 1995.
Okay.
Pope John Paul II, right?
Yes. At an abandoned Soviet airbase in Monrovia, the Pope publicly asked forgiveness for all the crimes and sins committed by the Catholic Church against Christians over the centuries.
An apology for the Inquisition, the religious wars.
For all the crimes and sins, yes. This was an unprecedented move coming after centuries of what the source describes as stonewalling and dismissing this difficult history.
How does the source interpret that apology? As genuine repentance?
Not entirely. To place this in a larger historical frame, the source interprets this apology as potentially a stratagem to erase the blackboard, effectively putting centuries of conflict behind them and, critically, eliminating a major historical barrier between Catholics and Protestants.
A strategic move to enable future unity.
That's the interpretation. This, the source suggests, ultimately serves the Vatican's overarching ambition to be the leader of a worldwide ecumenical movement.
Leading a unified global religion.
The source points to the Vatican's strategic actions and elaborate diplomacy, including, it notes, prayer meetings with snake charmers, Buddhists, paganists of all shapes and sizes, questioning their supposed theological conservatism in pursuit of this goal. This prompts an important question for reflection from the source. Is this ecumenical drive connected to prophecies in Revelations 17 and 18, which depict a powerful, corrupt religious system, a church drunk with the blood of the martyrs? A concept, it notes, supported by centuries of Jesuit research into devising ever more painful tortures back in the day.
Wow, connecting modern ecumenism directly back to Revelation's prophecies and the history of persecution.
The source views this as a calculated geopolitical and religious move rather than a fundamental change of core doctrine or repentance for past power abuses.
The audacity of such a claim, connecting ancient prophecy to modern ecumenism and geopolitical strategy, is certainly provocative. And on December 30, 1993, another historic event occurred. The Vatican, for the first time in history, recognized Israel.
A major diplomatic shift after decades of non-recognition.
And now, let's turn to a particularly revealing aspect according to the source. Its highlighting of the Vatican's continued push for internationalizing Jerusalem.
Making it a corpus separatum and international city.
It suggests a plan to administer the Temple Mount for Muslims, Jews, and Christians as part of their broader program of world ecumenical leadership, taking control of the world's most contested holy site.
A key insight here is the source's interpretation of Old Testament prophecies, specifically Zechariah 12 and 14, where Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling and a burdensome stone to the entire world, potentially leading to a major conflict, even nuclear war.
Zechariah's prophecies about Jerusalem.
The only reason for Jerusalem's immense global relevance, the source emphasizes, is religious. It's noteworthy that its sudden importance to Islam is highlighted once it became important to Jews, despite, the source claims, not being mentioned directly in the Quran.
Interesting point.
This prompts a crucial question from the source. Will this internationalizing push lead to an environment where Jews are allowed to rebuild their temple on the Temple Mount?
The third temple?
Yes. The source mentions scientific evidence and research by scholars like Asher Kaufman and Tuvia Sejev regarding the temple's potential actual location, maybe not under the dome of the rock itself. It also notes the temple institutes active preparations in Jerusalem, including making implements and training priests.
They're actually preparing for it.
And the source points out that Jesus, Paul, and John all make reference to a standing temple in Jerusalem prior to the Second Coming, suggesting this is a significant prophetic indicator for our time.
It's incredible to see current events, like the debates over Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, interpreted through such a specific and detailed prophetic lens provided by the source.
It connects the dots from ancient history to today's headlines and future predictions.
Finally, our source wants us to grasp the sheer scale and profound agenda of the Roman Catholic Church today. It notes its vast size, over 1 billion followers, hundreds of thousands of priests, thousands of bishops, millions of parishes, and calls it the wealthiest institution on the planet Earth today.
Immense global reach and resources.
Moreover, it asserts, this institution has a very specific agenda. It's fascinating, according to our source, how it is not fashionable to speak of Catholic doctrine among evangelical circles, unlike discussions, say, with Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons.
A perceived blind spot or reluctance to engage critically.
The source believes these differences are very material, particularly regarding the core doctrine of salvation, contrasting the Bible's teaching of salvation through Jesus Christ alone, sola fide, sola gratia, with a view that salvation is, to some extent, in the hands of the Pope and mediated through the Church's sacraments.
This prompts a critical inquiry from the source. Why does this history of bloodshed, geopolitical maneuvering, and doctrinal shifts matter beyond academic interest? Why should we care today?
Right, what's the bottom line?
The source argues that it's the protestations of infallibility and the claim of being God's authority on the earth in contrast to the scripture that are critically important for understanding the institution's nature and agenda.
The claim to ultimate authority apart from the Bible.
Precisely. The source contends that the final one-world religion, as described in some prophetic texts like Revelation, will be a form of pseudo-Christianity, a religion cloaked in Christian trappings but fundamentally altered at its core.
A counterfeit Christianity.
Therefore, the Vatican's ecumenical agenda, as it seeks global religious leadership, aligns, in the source's view, with prophecies it finds in Revelation 17 about this end times religious system. The source also points to Daniel 2.44, which speaks of God's kingdom being established suddenly by a cataclysmic intervention, not a gradual takeover by a human-led church. This underscores a belief that true spiritual change comes from divine intervention, not human-orchestrated ecumenism or political maneuvering.
A very distinct interpretation of history and prophecy. We've certainly covered a vast, intense, and often startling history today, pulling back the curtain on aspects of the Church's past that, well, many of us simply aren't exposed to in such candid detail.
It's a lot to process.
The frankness of our source material has given us a perspective that directly connects ancient history to modern headlines and even profound prophetic insights, urging us to think critically about the implications.
What's particularly resonant here, I think, is the source's urgent call right at the end for a deeply personal commitment to the gospel, for diligently learning and memorizing scripture, and for families to actively engage with biblical study.
Why the emphasis on personal study?
It views this as a vital safeguard against a potential dark age recurring, or being deceived by a pseudo-Christianity that looks appealing on the surface. And to place this in a larger historical frame, the source leaves us with a stark warning. The primary threat isn't necessarily the New Age movement, it argues, but rather what it calls a hostile, power-drunk harlot, referring back to its interpretation of Revelation. It urges us to watch for a strange rapport between the Vatican and Islam, as part of a cynical power play in an age of deceit.
Watching for a Vatican-Islam alliance. That's a specific and provocative warning.
It is. This is something truly worth mulling over and exploring further on your own, considering the current global landscape and the historical context the source provides.
Absolutely. This has been a truly challenging but immensely informative historical narrative, inviting us to look beyond conventional understandings. For those of you who want to continue your own deep dive, The source material specifically recommends Dave Hunt's book, A Woman Rides the Beast, and also Haley's Bible Handbook for historical context.
Good resources to dig deeper into this perspective.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into these profound topics. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep digging, and keep seeking those aha moments.